Hey everyone, it's Elizabeth Baines and welcome to The Creative Voice, a creativity-focused podcast. Hear from local voices in their own words in the city of Detroit.
And I'm Danny Wu, co-host of the show.
And during the day, I publish books. I run a blog called Umami Detroit, and I lead my family's 79 years in printing empire called Maze Multimedia.
And I'm a creative strategist and visual designer working locally in the city, currently teaching at Wayne State University's graphic design department. Yeah.
Oh, come on, Professor. And this series is brought to you in partnership with the Detroit chapter of AIGA, also known as the American Institute of Graphic Arts, a volunteer-based membership organization that advocates for creative professionals, hence the creative voice.
Exactly. So if you guys have heard of us before or you're a first-time listener, you can follow us on social for updates on the latest events, episodes, or interviews at The Creative Voice Pod. That's The Creative Voice POD on Instagram. And we'll also be available through your traditional streaming services. If you have any questions for our show, email us at thecreativevoicepod@gmail.com. And we'll just get right into the introductions. We have a really cool guest in the studio.
Hello, people. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're so excited to be here. We are actually live inside, live meaning like the moment we're in. We are at Amadeus' studio.
Yes.
So I'm looking around and I'm seeing lots of wood to kind of give you guys a preliminary introduction to his particular medium. And we're excited to be here. So thank you for making time. And
Of course.
yes.
Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Especially after a very big weekend that you had. Every artist has its own medium backstory. Tell us why wood, why sculpting, why carving, and of course, please give our listeners an introduction to what it is that you do.
Amadeus Roy here. Artistically, I identify as an abstract constructionist, painter, sculptor, designer. What that means in layman's terms is I construct relief sculptures out of carved plywood, or I'm getting into live edge, as you can see, and then I treat them more like canvases after the fact. So it's acrylic painting on top of sculpture, and so it's kind of like a melding of two worlds. There is, of course, the backstory to that. Growing up in my early teens, my dad is a construction worker. That was my first job, doing drop ceilings, laying down, all that kind of stuff.
Andy.
So that was kind of my first introduction to a lot of things. And so working with wood and working with canvas, as I started painting later in the textural aspect of canvas, and I didn't like the limitations of everything's a rectangle, a square, or a circle. So when I started having creative ideas from the onset, they were the shape of the idea rather than fitting into more of a standard framing of a square. That sent me down the rabbit hole of how do I make these shapes, because I really had no idea. I was bugging other artists and trying to figure out secrets, and then I realized I could just paint on wood. From the first piece moving forward, it was always cutting the wood out first and then painting afterwards. And it's kind of just evolved from there as I'm always trying to learn things and dive deeper and learn new tricks of the trade. So they've always just gotten more elaborate over time to hopefully express the idea.
Gotcha. What age were you when you really picked it up and was like, okay, this is a medium that I want to work with?
I started painting when I was studying graphic design at Michigan State. We had a color and design class. I was 18 at the time. And so that was my first time really painting. I dabbled with some stuff in high school. I was an aimless creative, essentially, where it's just I would have an idea and it would be a drawing, or I painted my graduation cap, the cover art of Kanye West's graduation. So it was just random forms of expression, and then it slowly got refined as I found myself more. And so painting has always been cool, and it wasn't really too much of a hard thinking process. It was just, this is my natural form of expression.
You know what? I'm very, very grateful. I'm very lucky. I actually just acquired a piece.
Yeah,
actually 2 pieces.
Yes.
I didn't get a picture of the second one, but I don't need it because it's going to be in the house. Very excited. When I was looking at the catalog of work that you had, and I knew I wanted to support you and I knew I wanted to collect, I sent it to one of my girlfriends. And I was like, hey, these are the 2 pieces that I'm interested in. Give me some feedback. Her feedback was I could totally see you with either or. She started asking me deep questions well, how does the piece make you feel? Is it a part of your life? Do you know what room it's going to be in? I was like, God damn, man. I was like, okay. I was like, challenge me, which I'm always challenged and I love it. So then it made me think a little bit deeper, and I told her exactly what each piece made me feel or what I saw. And one of the things that she picked up, which I want you to give the listeners a visual as much as possible, is the colors. I've recognized. I purchased one of your pieces from your earlier practice, the blue. Yeah, which is a mouthful, and I like it. And I'm gonna learn it.
It's a run-on sentence.
He said a run-on sentence. My second piece, which is more of a semi-current piece in a way, right? And then the colors that you choose. What is the backstory around the color choice? And can you give them an idea if you had to use words to describe your color theory when creating your work?
Definitely, that's something that has taken a lot more thought, I would say. I hand mix all of my colors. It's something that I'm very passionate about, of getting them exactly right. We were talking about cooking earlier. It's like making recipes to me. And it's like adding spices. Through studying graphic design, which was like my first introduction to formal art education, there's a difference between RGB color wheel and blending pattern, and then CMYK.
There's no difference because I'm a printer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so CMYK being additive, the more color you add, the more vibrant it gets, where RGB, it kind of can get muddled. So you can see my paint selection is a relatively refined palette, and so it's all teals, magentas, a little bit of yellow just for a pop sometimes when needed, but it is through that CMYK process. That way I like very vivid colors. While I'm inspired by natural elements in the natural world, my colors are much more in a surrealist sense. So it's taking it to a different plane of existence to kind of, it's better to express, I guess, a universality rather than something that's can be more identified in like the here and now.
Gotcha.
And so, as you spoke, it's kind of evolved over time. I refined my colors. I was talking to my one homie, Lewis Bloom, and he was saying how when because he's a part of a team with Kristen Richardson, they like formulated their colors to the specific Pantones, to where it's like, these are the like 5 or 6 colors that all of our pieces are in, and that way you always know who it is, and it's much easier to get the paint because you can just take it to any shop and they're like, I need this color. Where mine, I have the same general colors, but since I work in little 4-ounce jars, I'm always remixing them. So as pieces get created, those hues kind of shift over time as I refine them slowly, or more and more. So eventually I would like to do that because that would be very cool.
Because that purple, fire. The blue, absolutely fire. It's also synonymous with a lot of the other pieces upstairs, because we're actually at his studio, and a few of the works, the Pantone colors that you have adjusted, and for those who don't know what Pantone is, PMS is Pantone Mix. What is it that M stand for? It's okay.
It's a color system.
I can't remember what the M is, system. And it's basically putting a number associated with a color. So that every time, regardless of whether color is going to be coated or matte or whatever kind of substrate is going to be applied on, it's always the same. And as in the world of printing, oh my gosh, working with PMS colors is so difficult in printing, because if we're going digital, wide format, offset, screen printing, it's a world out here. So I totally admired the color continuity of what you have in when it comes to a particular collective type of piece. Because with color, like you said, one drop left or one drop right can totally, one drop up or one drop down could really change the spectrum of the color.
Right.
And that's why I was like, describe the colors. Do you have a name for your purple or your blue? Like, I would love if you had like your own name for those 2 colors.
I will eventually.
Okay.
I'm still refining upstairs that it is across 4 different pieces, the same color palette. That's definitely some colors that I felt more at home with as I've developed them. So that's definitely the clearest path of like, I definitely see myself working with these more. And so when I stop making indecisions and am confident like this is the one, I'm definitely going to have names. Because they do have different like meanings and things. The only one I would have close to a name yet would be the blue that my character, the Nomad, is always painted in, which would be like nomadic blue or something like that. Because that's just, that color is specifically chosen or mixed by me because it's the overall aura of what I would attribute universal humanity to have right now. Is like, if I were to look at just the overall human experience, that's kind of the color I attribute to right now, which isn't exactly the best color. I would wish it for it to be something brighter and something happier, but it's a little bit more melodramatic.
Well, it's so interesting because like colors do reflect time, right? Nina Simone, my favorite artist, I love her so much. She kind of reminds me of my mother, which could make me a little bit more biased. But she said it's an artist's responsibility or duty to reflect the time.
100%.
And one of the pieces that I was drawn to the most, it reminded me of that cup, like that concessions cup with the colors.
Oh, the jazz pattern?
Is that what that's called?
That's the name of it.
That's what it's called?
The little like magenta with like the teal, the swooshes.
Swooshes, yeah, the very abstract
it's called
piece.
jazz.
Okay, and it reminded me of that. So, and when I looked at that color, it immediately took me back to the late '80s, early '90s, or whatever the time it was exactly. And I was like, So they brought like this warm familiarity, and I'm pretty sure, of course, even with this color, for someone who's following your journey of your artistic expression and even just time, they could see how these colors played a very significant role in the process and even just when you did it. Right? So I have one more question before Daddy jumps in because I know you itching. Okay, what unique approach do you know your talent has on wood that others don't?
It might sound a little cocky, but the easiest way to say it is just effort. There's tens of hours that is never seen and that you wouldn't even notice because woodworking is a very tedious process. Anybody who works with wood will know that. It's not like that's not like my secret that I keep hidden. It's like I just work way harder. But just that is the difference that I think is the kind of like the secret ingredient, whereas like you don't know it's there because all of my pieces are more on the simplistic side when it comes to design and composition. So it might look like it can be done quickly, but I'm sitting there and hyper fixating on this square millimeter of wood to make sure it's as smooth as the rest, make sure every single line flows with the rest of the piece. Just as I work with consistent colors, I work with consistent angles. As you can see on the shapes here, they all flow in a similar direction. I haven't established the fine degree yet because once again, I'm still refining. But yeah, I think it is mainly just like the natural flowing of it. Everything in nature kind of flows at a certain speed and it's always harmonious with each other. And I try to have my pieces fit directly into that rather than something that, wood you see more as like a construction tool. So it's square, right angles, all that kind of stuff, where mine is completely out the door with that.
Totally out. You guys have to see this. Like, I hope that while you're listening, you can also be following him or maybe adding to his newsletter.
Follow along. Instagram's easiest, Amadeus_Roy, but the newsletter is what I prefer.
When I'm looking at what's here, the first piece that I actually purchased is called Beginning Within the End. And you told me something about this piece that I did not recognize, so I needed to spend more time with the piece, right? In order to probably see what you said. That particular piece, as you said, is out of one piece of wood?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And I'm looking over here and I see that we have layers. And when I think about wood, most of the time my experiences with wood is either cutting it, burning it for a fire, or either, hammering something. And the thing about wood is that it's very temperamental, especially if you're using a certain kind of like speed or blow to it. How do you also handle your wood so that it doesn't crack or that it doesn't split or it doesn't do something where it honestly you would have to trash the entire piece because it literally has done what it's naturally supposed to do?
Right. Roll with the punches. You can see this is a firm cut, but there's gaps in some of the layers. And so there is a lot of things that, since I do work with acrylics and I work with very opaque, flat layered colors in my studio work, you can hide a lot of that kind of stuff. Like you can touch up the wood before it's finalized. Now that I'm stepping into live edge, that level of intensity is way higher. So it's just being careful. Though, the saying, measure twice, cut once, think 6 times, then measure twice, then cut once. My work is very procedural. So I know the next step when I'm 4 steps behind or in front of it. So I always know what's coming up. So I always know what to consider. And so it's just really making sure you have the full scope of the project in mind. There is no going back. There is no just painting over it and just being immensely careful because you don't want to just snap the piece in half. I work with sometimes where there's very fine points that are, sometimes when I'm too tired and I just swing my arm the wrong direction, I'll just snap a piece in half if I'm not careful. It's just my process is since it's laborious, it takes a lot of time, which just naturally makes it meditative and it can really make it more peaceful, which definitely helps keep things like that from happening. It's definitely not a high stress environment.
Yeah, and I want y'all to quote what he just said. I want you to repeat it, but I think I got it right. Think 6 times, then measure twice, and then cut once.
Yes.
Come on now. You done took my measure twice, cut once to another level. I don't even think I want to say that anymore. I just want to give you credit. But no, that's dope. And then, of course, like, the step. What is that? What's next? 4 steps before?
Just keeping the whole scope in mind.
You mentioned color, and then you also mentioned specifically what it represents. So in your artist statement, you actually talk about holistic psychology, environmentalism, and prehistoric anthropology. So can you elaborate what that means exactly? Because I think for listeners who may have not seen your work before, or they do see it, but they don't get what you're talking about.
So to kind of touch on each, holistic psychology, I'm a huge proponent of therapy, and holistic psychology is kind of just the lane that works. As an artist, all of your work, I fully invest in that it's supposed to reflect the times, but naturally you can't really take yourself out of it too much, so it's also a reflection of me. The way that I interpret both my own experience on this planet and then the more of the macro level things is through a lot of meditation, a lot of internal thought and reflection. That's all kind of in the holistic psychology side of things, is just kind of exploring the brain. That's where the genesis of everything comes from, is just through going on walks and just picking my own brain and finding all the little crevices that exist and seeing what pops up. Environmentalism, like I've mentioned, it's all my inspiration comes from natural elements. I find myself outside as much as possible, and I'm always trying to advocate for, the species that can't speak for themselves. We dominate this planet heavily, and it drives me insane, and I will rant to the ends of the earth about it. And so, while I'm not directly, in like a showing of my work, I'm not directly yelling at you of like, save the planet, but it's definitely the undertone in everything of living within harmony of nature. And then the prehistoric anthropology is just the way I like to see my work is a lot of art, especially in the contemporary sense of the modern times, is reflective of the self and the one creating, and it's very identity focused. And I'm kind of an antithesis of that, where rather than having the work be about myself, I'd rather be the narrator of what's being spoken about. So rather than about the me, it's more about the total we and the encompassing of all humans. And so that includes all of our ancestral history. We live in America. We were brought up on Western history, the Western writing and teachings of everything. And so just prehistoric anthropology kind of means like the white man, when he says prehistory, that's pre whatever they decided, and it kind of starts the agricultural revolution forward. And so prehistoric anthropology is from the second Homo sapiens evolved into whatever we are, and recognizing every form of indigenous culture, every different way of how humans have developed life across the planet, rather than just what we choose to recognize as a part of like the story we teach.
Yeah, we're talking about how people have defined milestones in civilization, but that's largely told through the eyes of the victor and through the eyes of someone who has acquired power and resources to paint themselves in a better light. Where I recently only discovered this last year, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs is because he studied indigenous people, the Blackfoot people, and he actually didn't draw the diagram correctly, and we end up using it to justify so much stuff about fundamental needs that you need to have. That's actually not a psychological theory that's complete, because we're taking it without the context of the people that he learned. So that's wild to me. Because you get taught this stuff in school, one of those like 101 concepts, and then you don't actually understand where he got the concept from and the wisdom of that space, why their research is so different. So specifically, he made notes here too. Maslow basically observed different qualities in the members of the culture. So he said that how do they deal with child rearing, or basically raising a child is raising a village. And understanding is First Nations perspective is that self-actualization is at your base, then you build community, and then you create cultural perpetuity, meaning that you're always going towards a collective understanding, from understanding yourself and your relation to your immediate surroundings. It also is a expansive concept of like dimensions of time, because you're talking about the generations that came before you and the generations that will come after you. The reverse of that ends up happening in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because we talk about that as individual rights and privilege in one lifetime. Your physiological and your safety and your belonging, all the way up to your self-actualization and your aesthetic, your needing to know and understand, which is a little bit more like mentally sophisticated. They consider that the ground floor. They're like, you should understand yourself and how you relate to the rest of the things on this planet. And then you should be focusing on contributing to the rest of the planet, because it's a sustainable cycle. It's not like you take it and then you go. And it's not as individualistic, which I find was really interesting. So other researchers, one person, Edgar Villanueva, He wrote a book called Decolonizing Wealth in 2018, and he basically was interviewing someone that was part of the Navajo tribe in the Potlatch community, and she describes how people in the Cheyenne River territory like address poverty. And she said they don't have a word for poverty. They just have a description that's to be without family, to be without community is considered poverty. It's a foreign concept that someone could be so isolated and without any sort of safety net or kinship that they would be suffering from poverty. To me, it's really interesting because Maslow completely omitted this idea that there needs to be a communal cooperation at the base. And that also affects Western psychology and thought, because I've looked at your trajectory and you've started to do group shows, you were doing the art club feature, but then you also taught a guest workshop at the DIA last year. How have it been when you're in these activated shared spaces versus you having like a one-on-one or selling stuff in your studio and talking to someone who's interested directly? What's the difference being a part of a larger collective and showing your art versus showing your art very intimately?
Well, first, the open studio was great. Definitely think it was the right decision at the right time. So that was very fruitful, I would say. Something like the open studio was an active exploration into something like that, of comparing the two of a more direct, I don't want to say consumer, but direct to person of interest rather than something like a group show. The beginning stages of art is you get into group shows because no one's going to just throw a solo show at you and bank their entire financial balance of a studio on this person you've never heard of.
Yeah.
And so I've had years of doing group shows to varying degrees, varying levels of esteem or acclaim, and some are curated, some are open theme, and all that kind of stuff. And I've always seen that my work sticks out a lot, especially in the local market. A lot of art that looks curated, and there's this giant, colorful, round-shaped thing that's like jumping off the wall.
Yeah.
And that's not like a comparison of like what is better or anything like that, but just stylistically the differences.
Right.
And so I've always been on a journey of finding the places where I feel like I'm at home, or my work feels like it's at home. And so it's been trying to get closer to the general experience of like community-led things, where having something that's more solely based on my work or my output, it's been cool because it allows you to have a much more face-to-face interaction and be able to have conversations such like this, where it's, in abstract work, a lot of themes can get lost because in the eye of whoever is looking at it and whatever you're thinking about that day, you might attach a thought to it. And it's not always about the success of getting your point across, because it, at the end of the day, is colors and shapes. It's not representational. And so being able to have those conversations in a more intimate setting has been very beneficial, and it's cool because then people can understand the work better, but then also it gives me chances to kind of refine and understand what I'm doing. The conversations I have in my head are one thing where there's a lot of assumptions made because I know everything I'm thinking, but when I have to put words to it, it allows me to elaborate a lot more. So that's been very cool.
No one felt rushed or distracted. I do know specifically when going to exhibitions, whether it's a group or solo, you kind of get an idea of who might be there, or, the kind of crowd, where your personal display of your work at your home was more of an intimate space. So people got to talk to you, ask you questions, move about, look, spend time with the piece. I think, we don't always get time to really spend time with the pieces. Really appreciated that when I came here, was to be able to spend time with you and the piece, because, you're synonymous with the work. I don't buy work unless I really also believe in the artist.
Right.
I think a lot of people just, they might buy art, which is, it's fine. People can do what they want, but they buy art because either they feel like the relativity or, just the significance of the work. But I think there's so much character behind the work that needs to be related to the artist. I hold people accountable. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's just me, because I want to be like, oh, I got this, who's this? Oh, that's Amadeus Roy. Let me tell you a little bit about him. I don't want to be the kind of collector where I just have so many pieces that I can't have a conversation about what's on my wall.
100%.
Especially if I can have a conversation about what's in my refrigerator. Like, I'm eating, I'm consuming it, I know where it's growing, I want to know those things, and I feel like with art as well,
I mean, it's important to put that level of intention behind what you acquired, because as a piece lives in your space, it permeates into your thoughts. It is such a subconscious experience.
That part.
Because, after it's in your house for long enough, you don't really notice it as much, but it's still there.
I have a lot of art in my house. Otherwise, I would have considered buying a piece. But then I was like, okay, let me hold off on that. But I do have a fairly large-scale piece. It's very similar to the circular tissue paper draft you have here. And it's by a local artist who does wood carving and printmaking. So it's one giant sphere that is basically covered in, flowers. And it's a black and white on kind of pressed rice paper style. So I had a custom shadow box built for it. And whenever I look at it, it feels really grounding in a way that I can't really describe, because most people be like, whoa, it's like so intricate and it's like so detailed that someone had to carve a reverse relief and then make a print that large. And it takes a lot of time to do. But for me, that just looks like a globe full of flowers. And that's actually just a nice thought. If I'm just walking past the kitchen in my house, like I'm like, oh, there's the flowers. I can't always keep plants alive, but I could definitely frame something.
It's okay. Less pressure. Less pressure.
Yeah.
What's your favorite sensory experience with the wood?
Yeah.
Ooh. There's a couple.
Polishing.
It's like my dad and I were just ranting. My dad helps me with some of the larger level projects. Like I've been getting into furniture design, so I tap him for a lot of things that I just don't know.
Oh wow!
We were rambling just yesterday of how different species of wood smells when you're cutting it or sawing it, just like the sawdust, the elm, the shit.
So Paul Karras runs a studio, and he does largely like a lot of more like sculptural fabrication, interior build outs for retail spaces and things. So he has an industrial design background, and he worked in the Sufmato fragrance, like store build out was one that he was responsible for with a couple other people. He had a studio in Pony Ride, and I'm not sure where his studio space is because it's moved around a couple times. But because he worked primarily in furniture and build out, he's talked a lot about how it impacts his material choices and also just how he's modeling things and custom making things. Cool dude, you'd probably be friends.
In the techniques that I develop, a lot of it is refining the wood more and more. So all my shapes are very soft in design. I try to have the physical entity also be very soft. So originally, I would just cut the wood out, kind of get rid of like the large imperfections, but it would be hard right angles on the edges. But my older pieces, it's very much this layer's on top of this layer. And it's all right angles. And then I discovered a router with a round over edge to where I could have sloping edges and make it much softer. And so the physical touch of like sanding it down to a 600 grit and you have it a nice perfect round edge, like running your fingers to check for imperfections and everything, and just having that tactile feel, that is miraculous.
I already have a visual idea of the work, of course. Then I was thinking about weight. When I look at this piece, I feel like your piece is also synonymous with the weight of it. Not just because I know about how a piece of wood feels, but even then, different pieces of wood has different weight, right? Like working with plywood versus working with, what do you call this one right here?
This is elm.
Elm. They all have different weight and mass. It feels more like an anchor when I look at the work.
100%. The kind of the angle that I design all my shapes at, it's an upward trajectory. Refined in my construction styles more and more. I had a heavier quality to them, like pieces that aren't very old. But now I like to have that juxtaposition of the density of wood. This is quite heavy, but through the design and the composition, it almost feels like it's floating.
That part, right? It feels like what I can tell that I know that the piece is heavy, but the way that you design it, it just feels like, probably, I don't know, not even a frame on a wall.
When you're talking about floating, thinking about a lot of stuff right now, because when you see a lot of art that's based in Buddhist tradition or meditative tradition, they talk about floating as a sentiment, and you look at paintings in China, Japan, even India, they have a specific style of clouds that are called scrolling clouds. And so your stuff reminds me of that, but yours is more abstract. And theirs is rooted in a flat dimensionality that's just with line art, and then a little bit of like radiant lift. This actually makes a lot of sense that you say floating, because floating specifically for Japanese like ukiyo painting, they talk about the floating world, meaning they actually believe that you have planes between the sky and the earth and the water. And that's a very cool environmental connection that it didn't occur to me until just now. My other question was, do you have any advice for artists about selling? Like, be honest, how's it been going? And then the question after that is just about the difference between murals that you've done from 2022 to now. But let's get real about selling art.
The consumerism, the capitalism of it all.
Part of it,
no,
really.
100% the survival. It's all experimentation. That's what the open studio is, and just trying different avenues. I personally am in an effort to have basically just having the control or having the jurisdiction within myself, so I'm not relying on somebody else's handing out of an opportunity. I love being in gallery shows. I think I see the value in it, and I enjoy those experiences. I value the people more than anything else, and having the relationships. I think just being very intentional with everyone you meet. There was no art until I painted my first mural, which in 2022 was the first piece of public art in Harper Woods' history at Salter Park, which is where I grew up playing and stuff.
Wow.
And so in my journey of being an artist, my first step was learning how to consume art and finding out that I am allowed to exist in the art world. Like, art can be for someone like me, because if it's never around, you kind of subconsciously are like, oh, that stuff is for the rich people over there. It's
in the museum, the galleries, the buyers, that kind of vibe.
And so I'm always trying to pick other people's brains that digest art heavily in the specifically a selling aspect of like what goes into your decision making of purchasing a piece. How do you consume art? What do you think about when you look at it outside of selling, so I can take that back to my people and educate on this is how you can digest art in a way that works for you, since we're not taught on how to do it. And we're not really naturally exposed unless like your grandma has a piece in the house or something like that. Through those studies, I've learned how a lot of people, unless you're looking at it through an investment, which I can't speak to that as much, but strictly through a connection aspect, being able to accurately dictate why you create, what you create, and what it's saying, and knowing what your point of view is in your work can go a super long way in having someone connect with it and then being compelled to purchase it. If I had one tip, it would just be to make sure you know what you're doing and you're able to speak on it eloquently, because it can make a big difference.
Yeah, the artist perspective, the artist statement. I remember when we first interviewed Ivan, he was like, I wasn't really taught how to truly make an artist statement and write it. So I actually had to find a Skillshare to figure out how to apply for the Kresge grant. And I'm like, yeah, and you applied to it on a fluke in the middle of winter because you were like, why not? And then suddenly you had your first solo show after your group show, and you were able to construct a whole narrative for a series of paintings and articulate it in a very specific way, and in a way that's appealing to somebody who may be collecting art. You also mentioned that like that first mural you did was a public piece. In the realm of public pieces, and you get maybe some commissions to do certain things, is there a specific theme that you geared towards that's consistent in your murals that are connected to your paintings in some way? Or are you more about what is being asked for that project individually and like tailoring the art to reflect that particular ask?
It's a little bit of both. I would start off by saying I've been blessed that all the murals are 90%, if not 100% creative decision making. I want you to paint this. I try to stay away from those personally. The murals and the studio work naturally will always be harmonious because it's just as much of my own pure expression as a studio piece. I like my work to be uplifting to the viewer. We've spoken on some larger level topics and things, but I don't like to scare these things into the viewer, which is a lot of art that's really trying to say something. I think usually lends towards like the shock and the disgust factor, because then you're really listening when you're like, oh my God. Where I like to introduce these topics more akin to like, let's go walk in the woods and talk about it, where it's like a gentle exposition of these themes. Especially with public pieces where these are out in the world, the people that live near them. And so I like to keep that in mind. And what contribution can I do? If my work is going to be there living with them, what can it do to, not motivation in the sense of like go out and hustle, but more in the motivation of keep at whatever you're doing. We got to commit effort to something. And so if I can give you a little nudge to continue doing it, I try to be very optimistic, still grounded in the sense of realism. This is not a utopia, and so I'm not going to treat it like it is, but I'm going to treat reality with the sense of hope. And I'm going to hope to add that hope to you as well, because I can see how beneficial it is. But then, at the same time, to speak to the duality of my intentions creatively, every piece I've made is also hyper site-specific. One, that means determining the composition based on the wall, whether it's a standard rectangle or something a little bit more. I like to make sure that this design has a home on the wall it's being painted on. It's not like I can't copy and paste this anywhere else. And then I try to keep the environment in mind, the neighborhood, the community, and all these things where it's, I want it to fit in. I want it to be a part of the community, changing what might be the subconscious in the area.
Mural work in Detroit kind of falls into two camps. It's either more artistically specific, we let the artist kind of interpret and put what they want out there, or it's other mural work that feels very heavily commissioned and has a very specific commercial intent. And it's not that one is worse than the other, but we live in a city where we see it in like one public space. So for people to discern something that we see out in the world and then understand where's the artist coming from, what were their limitations if they had any, what was their intent in that space and what they wanted to do. Specifically, I'm referring to Phil Simpson and his smiling feature that took over the other mural of the whales. Debate about whether or not he should have done that, or the company that he worked with to commission that piece should have placed it there, whereas there were other buildings that they could have like taken over and put something there. And the thing is, one, for him, from what I understand in the interviews that he's done, he's about spreading positivity and good energy, and his work is known for the smiling faces motif, is known for being in the community. And he's like a local hero in a way for like that kind of aesthetic choice. I think
he's the only person really doing what he's doing in the way of actually spreading that.
Yeah, like the kind of joy that you see in that is very different and intentional. And he doesn't care if you're coming in and commissioning him to do something as long as you let him express that joy, right? That's the difference. Whereas I think some folks were very frustrated because the previous artist that had done a piece on there with the whales was making a very strong climate change statement at the time. But over the course of that, it's not really speaking to people right now. Most people don't even know the artist that did that piece, nor do they really understand the context. They just think of it as giant whales on the side of a building. That's kind of whimsical. And if you look at what was actually being asked of him when he did the piece on the wall, it was, we need to take care of nature and the planet and the oceans. And so I think about it now, and now that's been replaced by something else entirely. And I think Phil actually, I think he posted a social media status about it. Like, why was everyone so upset? It wasn't even a permanent piece, and it was a positive piece. I don't really want to hear this conversation unless you want to propose something different. And I think that's fair. We give so much flack to artists for trying to represent or being represented in a certain light because it's tied to the city. And so we have this very personal, oh, I'm hurt if it doesn't look the way I wish it did. And I think we project that onto the creative folks in the city a lot, when the reality is that we're all here and we all have different types of voices and we all contribute. And sometimes we have contrasting voices. So that to me is really interesting that you're saying, I've been fortunate to be able to do my stuff the way I want to do it, and also still be respectful of like the locations that I'm in.
Many cities, and I can count on, I don't know, several hands and feet exactly like how many pieces that I see, whether it's on my commute or it's in the direction of where I live or whatever it is outside, that, you know, is memory jogging, right? Or whether it's, you know, whether I feel like I connect with it or not. So the fact that you are putting your best foot forward when it comes down to like being considerate about the people and the residents that live or the ones that are passing by is really dope, because most of the time I know some artists in particular that are like, I don't care. This is what I want to create. This is what I'm saying. This is what I'm doing. And however it's perceived is how it's perceived.
It's a balance. You want to be able to add something new because you're producing something new, and so you want to add a new element to the conversation, but you don't want to just force feed anything because it's not received very well. Just having that balance and that understanding and consideration. You can have 1,000 different voices, especially on a community-led project where it's like everybody wants to see their vision. It falls back on the artist a lot of times of like making everybody happy, but also not trying to worry too much about making everybody happy.
Yeah.
So it's just always a balance.
Reminds me of the Detroit sign. Oh my gosh.
Exactly. You can't make anybody happy with that thing.
Jesus Christ. The renderings were just so...
Oh, they misled us. They
misled us. And then, of course, you know, AI started trying to play a factor, too. I was like, where is the realism? You know what I'm saying? Like the urban planning perspective of it, where it's kind of like, you know, I don't know. That drove me crazy, too. I'm not even gonna lie.
We could have been able to do something better if we had reached out to local artists and creative firms instead of just having a fabricator pitch something that was very clearly, they probably were rushed to do the job as well, because I was showing my design students a placemaking wayfinding design system for the city of Baltimore. And they did it, and they made the more of the word Baltimore in the silhouette of a heart and creates an arrow to different sites in the city. And you see it in these giant pillars that have a little heart arrow every part of town. And that shows like thought and pride and intention. And also functionality, right? Like the signage clearly helps you go someplace that is notable in Baltimore. this is because they contacted a great studio where people care.
Right. Well, also because my thing is that the fabricator is not, it doesn't have the vision. They have the vision of how to put it together.
Right.
And like to utilize the supplies or the tools. But when it comes down to like the creativity, I think we definitely, I'm not going to give too much input, but I think when doing a piece like that, especially from such a creative city, I think it's really important that, all cities are very well aware of all the different communities, whether it's architecture or design or whether it's, the food community or whatever it is, because a lot of the times when you make one decision, there's also so many others that can be involved. So go ahead.
My last question was really just, you wear so many hats, and you mentioned earlier in the interview that you actually went to school for graphic design, and I did a little snoop on your website, and apparently you've made some sort of album and music at some point?
I did at some point, yes.
Yeah. So what would you, like being on this creative journey of trying different mediums and venues, what would you say to your younger self about where you are now? Is there anything that you would want to say?
The direction you choose to go in will get you to where you're trying to go. Louis Bloom, he asked me, like, if you could reintroduce yourself to somebody that you're close to, how would you do it differently? To me, I'm not too big on revisionism of like looking back, I wish I did this differently. I just try to learn as much as I can from the things that I've been through. And so in this case, I'm not going to say like, I never made a mistake and like everything I did was right and I've worked out and everything works out and it's great. Where it's like, that's obviously not the case, but the journey that I've taken is only led me to have more excitement to continue pursuing what I'm doing. And
that's so cool.
And yeah, I did make an EP at one point. I was a graphic designer for like a startup company at one point. I did do all those different things in the previous life where now I am I still do multiple hats, but they're all under a more refined umbrella, I would say.
You've got to focus for yourself.
Exactly. And so going through all those experimentations, because even the things that I've put out into the world, there's 17 other things that at one point I was convinced I have to be a master at these as well. And so it's just going from the very wide net and then slowly working your way into where I finally have kind of figured out once again, back to the POV, I figured out what I want to say. I figure out how I want to say it. And I'm now able to let that understanding of my creativity then orchestrate the other ways I want to spread out now. So rather than going from wide into narrow, now I was able to go from narrow into wide. So now I'm venturing out again. I'm doing things outside of my normal practice, but it's still within the same ecosystem, so it's cohesive now.
Self-actualization to collective. There we go.
Okay, write that down because I got a lot of good notes. Just listening to you very philosophical is the word I'm trying to say.
7 thought processes going at the same time.
You did. Oh my God, I had a great time talking with you and your partner earlier, and we talked about so many different things, especially related to design. We got a Scorpio in the studio, y'all. Scorpio. Feelings. And also just like, your aptitude determines your altitude. Is that what they say?
That is what they say.
Yeah. Just listening to you, I don't want to sound like a senior, but your head is on the right. You got your head on your shoulders. You know what I'm saying? Like, I really just love, and I think I have the pleasure now, of course, just listening to you more. And before I met you at Art Prize, and your piece, honestly, I think your stop was my favorite.
Thank you.
Yes, you, and then my boy Amanda Sweet's husband. I hate to say the spouse his name too before, but I think it goes by Breezy-O-Matic. Don't quote me, but he had a really, really dope interactive piece as well. And I was like, those two stood out with me. And then of course, I just stayed in contact with Amadeus. I joined your mailing list and then followed you online. And then I was like, I'm gonna collect a piece. And then here we are. After collecting the piece, I was like, we would love to have you in the studio. And we're very, very intentional about who we interview. We have so many different creative universities and schools and colleges that there's really no reason unless, they pay us well.
Yeah. If you have a speaking engagement, budget.
Well, we'll show up, if it's for a check. Right, exactly. We'll show up for a check, but we will volunteer our time and our energy for our local creatives because this program is really funded by Danny and I. Putting in our own money to, make this happen. So if you're listening and you would like to be a sponsor, or you want a commercial segment, I don't know. Please hit us up. The creativevoicepod@gmail.com.
If you want to throw down some hypey shit, you can. You have a newsletter, a mailing list. So last thing, plug away.
Yeah, plug away. Give us an idea if there's anything you want to promote, anything that's coming up, or if you just want to make sure that everybody knows how to stay in contact with you.
For sure. Well, if you want to follow along after this, Instagram is probably the populous way of, once again, Amadeus_Roy. If you want to join the mailing list, which is much more of a direct relationship, you can hit me up. I can't just add anybody because you know the legal rights of like giving consent.
Yeah.
So DM me on that same Instagram to say, hey, I want to join the mailing list, and then you can get special discounts on pieces and hear about what I'm doing.
This is great. You know, I got to do my little, my outro. But thank you so much, Amadeus Roy. So follow him online. Of course, with our social media, we'll have hashtags and also at. And thank you again for having us. And for listeners who want to hear more, check us out on Spotify. Eventually, we'll be on.
It'll be on Acast. So you'll still be able to listen to it via Spotify or Apple Podcasts or even Amazon Podcasts if you want to through our RSS feed. But all of our episodes will be hosted through Acast first.
Gotcha. Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, but also because we want to support musicians and other podcast creators and small creators. So that is a clear and decisive choice. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you.
Amadeus. It was really nice. You have a very smooth voice, by the way, speaking voice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great for radio. Make sure to follow us on social for more updates. We're usually just through Instagram, so the Creative Voice Pod or the Creative Voice Pod at Gmail for any requests or questions.
Yeah.
You obviously can slide into the DMs, but it is a business account, so.
And for those that are listening, please follow us on Instagram because Danny does a really great job, and I do too, but she's more like 80%. She really is good at like reposting. Okay. Check it out because we're always posting about events, exhibitions, talks, openings, even sharing music about local artists. Because we are the creative voice, we are literally touching on so many different genres of creativity when it comes down to art or curators or designers or bakers.
Creative people in the food industry.
We will, and I'm super excited about that. So follow us online so that you can kind of get an idea of what's happening in the city of Detroit.